They thought he was an easy target, but they had no idea who they were messing with. The bell above the diner door jingled as a man walked in, his boots scraping against the old checkered floor. He looked like any ordinary traveler, cap pulled low, jacket a little dusty, quiet eyes that didn't invite conversation. The place smelled of burnt coffee and fried food, the kind of diner where the jukebox was broken and the booths had cracks in the seats. Every head turned when he stepped inside. There were no smiles, no polite nods, only long stares. In the corner, a group of bikers went silent. Their laughter died the moment he entered, and now they were watching him the way wolves watch a stray deer. The man didn't say a word. He walked slowly to a booth near the window, sat down and placed his hands on the table. The waitress came over nervous, tapping her pen against the notepad. He ordered a cheeseburger, fries, and a black coffee. Nothing more. Across the room, one of the bikers leaned back in his chair, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, his voice thick with mockery. "Looks like we got ourselves a tourist." His buddies laughed under their breath. The man didn't react. He just lifted his coffee cup, took a quiet sip, and set it down again. Calm, silent, still. But in that silence, something was building, something the bikers couldn't see. Not yet. The man sat quietly in his booth, eyes on the window as the dusty road outside stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He didn't fidget, didn't shift in his seat. His stillness was almost unsettling, like he'd been in places where waiting was second nature. The waitress returned a few minutes later with his steaming cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. She tried to smile, but her eyes flicked nervously toward the corner table where the bikers sat. They hadn't stopped staring. The man noticed, of course, but he gave her a small, polite nod and said, "Thank you." His voice was soft, calm, the kind of tone that carried respect without effort. She gave the faintest smile back, relieved that at least he wasn't rude. Then she hurried away. The biker with the thick beard, the one who had spoken earlier, leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. He wanted attention, wanted to stir something up. "Hey, buddy," he called across the diner, his voice echoing louder this time. "You deaf or just plain rude?" His friends chuckled, one of them slapping the table with the palm of his hand. They were enjoying themselves, trying to draw the stranger into their game. But the man didn't take the bait. He traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger, eyes fixed on the dark liquid. His calmness, his refusal to rise to their noise, made the bikers restless. People who feed on fear don't know what to do when there's none to be found. The room itself seemed to take sides. A couple sitting by the door shifted uncomfortably, whispering under their breath. The cook, visible through the kitchen window, had stopped flipping burgers just to see how this would play out. Even the old man in the far booth was staring, fork frozen halfway to his mouth. The diner was small, but in that moment it felt tighter, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Beardman pushed his chair back with a loud scrape, the sound sharp against the silence. He rose slowly, adjusting his vest, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. His presence carried weight, not because of strength, but because he wanted everyone to watch. And they did. The man in the booth didn't flinch. He lifted his cup again, took another quiet sip, and placed it gently back on the saucer. His face gave nothing away. That composure only made Beardman angrier. He smirked, shaking his head like he'd just found the perfect way to spend the afternoon. "Seems like you don't know how things work around here," he sneered, his voice low and mocking. "This is our spot. You're sitting where you don't belong." The other bikers laughed again, louder this time, feeding off their leader's arrogance, but the man didn't look at them. He finally lifted his gaze, calm and steady, locking eyes with the biker standing over him. For a second, the laughter dulled. There was something in that stare. Not threat, not fear, just a depth that didn't break. Then, in a voice measured and even, he said, "I'm just here for lunch." Simple words. No anger, no bravado, just truth. And somehow that truth carried more weight than all the noise in the room. Beardman's grin widened when he heard the stranger's calm reply. To him, it sounded like weakness, a quiet excuse from someone who didn't know how the world worked in their little corner of the highway. He leaned closer, his shadow stretching across the booth like a warning. "You're not listening, friend," he said, pounding his fist lightly on the table, making the salt shaker rattle. "This seat ain't for you. You should get up before you regret it." The other bikers whistled and clapped like a rowdy audience, their boots stomping against the floorboards. They wanted a show. They wanted to see their leader put the stranger in his place, but the man in the booth didn't move. His posture remained loose, shoulders relaxed, one hand resting on the table, the other curled gently around his coffee cup. He didn't blink. He didn't break eye contact. And somehow, that stillness was more unsettling than if he had yelled back. The waitress had frozen behind the counter, her eyes darting nervously between the biker and the quiet man. She gripped her notepad so tightly her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth as if to say something but thought better of it. This wasn't her fight. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice as steady as before. "Something I can help you with?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't defensive. It was almost polite, as though he were asking if the biker needed directions or a refill on his coffee. But it landed differently. It carried weight. For the first time, Beardman hesitated. Just for a second, his smirk faltered. The tone wasn't what he expected. He wanted fear, or at least a burst of anger, something he could grab onto and use. Instead, he got composure, and it threw him off balance. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with stringy hair, shouted from the corner, "Show him, Travis. Teach him some manners." The name hung in the air like smoke. Travis. The leader, the one who wanted control. Travis clenched his jaw, covering the small crack in his confidence. He slammed his palm harder on the table this time, the sound echoing through the cramped diner. Glasses rattled behind the counter. The cook cursed under his breath and ducked back into the kitchen. "I don't think you heard me," Travis growled, his eyes narrowing. "You don't belong here." The man finally set his coffee cup down, carefully placing it on the saucer. He looked up fully now, his gaze steady and unshaken. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the firmness in it. "Back off." 2 words, softly spoken but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the air. The entire diner went silent. Even the bikers shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging glances. There was no raised tone, no visible threat. Yet those words carried an authority that didn't come from arrogance. It came from experience, from someone who had faced far worse than a handful of rowdy bikers in a small-town diner. But Travis didn't back down. He couldn't, not with an audience watching. Pride wouldn't let him. His smirk returned, though thinner this time, and he leaned in closer until his vest brushed the stranger's arm. "Or what?" he whispered, trying to keep the upper hand. The quiet man didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held Travis's stare, as though time itself had slowed around them. And in that silence, everyone watching felt it. Something was about to break. The diner held its breath. Plates sat untouched, forks suspended in midair. Even the old ceiling fan seemed to turn slower, its squeak dragging across the silence. Travis loomed over the booth, close enough that the smell of cigarettes and leather clung to the air around him. The quiet man, still seated, still composed, let his fingers rest flat on the table. He wasn't coiled to strike. He wasn't defensive. He looked almost bored. But in that stillness there was something steady, something unshakable. Travis hated it. He wanted fear. He wanted resistance. He wanted to feel like he was in charge. Instead, the stranger gave him calm, and calm made him feel small. "Last chance," Travis muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Get up and walk out that door." The man didn't blink. His answer came low, almost gentle, but it carried like thunder through the room. "I'd rather finish my lunch." The words hit harder than a shout. Around the diner, people exchanged uneasy glances. The waitress shifted nervously, her hand inching toward the phone on the counter. She knew trouble when she saw it, but the look Travis shot her froze her in place. The other bikers leaned forward in their seats, hungry for action. One of them whispered, "Do it, Travis," as if daring him on. And then, with a suddenness that made the whole diner flinch, Travis slammed his fist down beside the man's plate. The table shook, the salt shaker toppled, and the sound rang out like a warning shot. The stranger finally moved. Not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate. He lifted his gaze and locked eyes with Travis. His expression didn't change, but the weight behind that stare made Travis falter. For the first time, the biker leader felt the edge of something he couldn't name. "Back off," the man said again, quieter this time, like a truth rather than a threat. But Travis couldn't back down. His pride wouldn't let him. He reached forward, hand stretching for the stranger's collar. He wanted to drag him out of the booth to show everyone watching that this outsider wasn't untouchable. That was when everything shifted. Before his hand even touched fabric, The stranger's arm shot up with a speed no one saw coming. His fingers locked around Travis's wrist, his grip firm and unyielding. The biker froze mid-motion, caught off guard, his eyes widening as he realized how strong the man's hold was. "Don't," the stranger said softly, his tone steady, almost calm, but carrying a finality that made Travis's stomach twist. For a moment, it looked like Travis might fight back. His jaw tightened, his body tensed, but the iron grip around his wrist didn't budge. The strength there wasn't wild, wasn't reckless. It was controlled, practiced, the kind of strength that came from years of discipline, not ego. The diner fell silent again, every pair of eyes locked on the two men. The cook leaned out of the kitchen window, his spatula dangling uselessly in his hand. A young couple near the door looked ready to run if things got worse. Even the bikers hesitated, shifting uneasily in their seats. Travis yanked his arm free at last, stumbling back a step to save face. His friends laughed nervously, trying to cover the crack in their leader's confidence. But the sound didn't feel genuine. Even they sensed something was different about this man. Travis snarled, flexing his hand to shake off the sting. "Think you're tough, huh?" He spat, though his voice carried less power now. "We'll see about that." He turned to his crew, jerking his chin. "Get up." One by one, the other bikers rose from their seats. Leather creaked, boots thudded, chairs scraped across the floor. They spread out, forming a loose circle around the booth. Their smirks returned, but their eyes betrayed something else. A flicker of doubt. The stranger stayed seated, his hands resting calmly on the table, as though the half-circle of men around him didn't exist. He glanced at his coffee, half full, and then back at Travis. His voice carried softly across the tension-filled diner. "You don't want this." But Travis only grinned, mistaking calm for weakness. He cracked his knuckles and leaned forward, his voice low and taunting. "Oh, I think we do." And just like that, the storm everyone had been waiting for finally began to break. The circle of bikers closed in, their heavy boots thudding on the diner's worn floor. The air grew thick like the weight of a storm about to break. The waitress froze with the phone in her hand, her eyes wide and pleading, but Travis silenced her with a glare. The cook ducked back into the kitchen, the spatula clattering loudly against the metal counter. Everyone else just sat still. Nobody moved. Nobody dared breathe too loud. Travis sneered, his pride burning hotter than his common sense. "Last chance, tough guy. Walk out that door or we'll make you." The man didn't budge. He didn't blink. He simply set his cup of coffee down on the saucer with a soft clink. His voice came low, calm, steady, a whisper in the storm. "I told you, you don't want this." The words carried no anger, no heat, and somehow that made them heavier. But Travis laughed, throwing his arms wide to his crew. "Hear that, boys? He thinks he's some kind of hero." With that, he lunged, fists flying, and then everything shifted. The stranger moved like water, smooth and sharp at the same time. He slid out of the booth with a speed that caught the room off guard. In one clean motion, he caught Travis's arm mid-swing, twisted it behind his back, and guided him straight into the table. The impact rattled the plates and made the salt shaker topple onto the floor. Travis gasped, his chest pinned to the surface, his breath knocked from his lungs. For a moment, the entire diner was stunned into silence. It had happened too fast, too precise, too controlled. The stranger didn't gloat. He didn't yell. He leaned slightly, his grip still locked, and spoke in the same calm voice. "Stay down." But Travis, red with humiliation, jerked free and stumbled backward, clutching his arm. His crew jumped to their feet, shouting, pushing their chairs aside. The wiry one with stringy hair charged next, fists flailing, his mouth twisted in a snarl. But the stranger sidestepped easily, as if he had seen it all before. He drove his elbow gently but firmly into the biker's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The man collapsed into a chair, groaning, clutching his stomach. The room gasped. 2 down. The biggest of the bikers, tall, broad-shouldered, hands like sledgehammers, came from behind, trying to grab him by the shoulder. But that was another mistake. The stranger spun sharply, trapping the man's arm and sweeping his legs out from under him in one clean motion. The biker hit the floor with a heavy thud. Before he could get up, a knee pressed into his back. "Don't move," the stranger said softly, and the man froze. 3 down. Another biker grabbed a chair, swinging wildly. The attack was sloppy, desperate, The stranger ducked low, caught the chair mid-swing and yanked it free. The man lost his balance and stumbled backward. A gentle shove sent him crashing into a booth, groaning in defeat. 4 down. The last biker, younger than the rest, stood frozen, his hands trembling. He looked at his friend sprawled across the diner floor, moaning, beaten, humiliated, then looked at the man who hadn't even broken a sweat. The stranger tilted his head slightly, his eyes steady, calm, asking without words, "Are you next?" The young biker swallowed hard. Then he turned, bolting for the door. The bell above it jingled violently as he disappeared into the parking lot, his boots kicking up gravel. 5 down. The diner fell into silence again, heavier than before. The bikers lay scattered on the floor, groaning in pain, their arrogance stripped away in seconds. The customers, the waitress, even the cook stared in disbelief. The stranger adjusted his cap, brushed his sleeve as though straightening a wrinkle, and exhaled softly. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't shown anger. He had simply done what needed to be done, with control, with precision, with quiet strength, and that silence spoke louder than any punch. The diner sat frozen. The only sounds were the groans of the bikers scattered across the floor and the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. What had just happened didn't seem real. 5 men, tough and loud only moments ago, were now silent, clutching bruises and nursing their pride. The waitress, still clutching the phone she never got to use, slowly stepped out from behind the counter. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Sir, are you okay?" The stranger looked up at her. His breathing was steady, his face calm, almost as if nothing had happened. He gave her a faint smile. "I'm fine, ma'am. Thank you." Something about his tone caught her off guard. It wasn't prideful. It wasn't angry. It was polite, almost gentle. The kind of voice you'd expect from a man helping with groceries, not from someone who had just dismantled a gang of bikers in minutes. Travis, the leader, pushed himself halfway up from the floor, his face twisted with pain and disbelief. He spat blood onto the ground and glared at the stranger. His voice cracked as he demanded, "What the hell? Who are you?" All eyes turned toward the man, waiting for his answer. He didn't rush to speak. He picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it back down on the saucer. Then he looked at Travis, his expression unreadable. "Just a guy getting lunch," he said softly. The words seemed too simple, too plain, but they carried weight. The people in the diner shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. There was something in the way he said it, something that hinted at a truth far bigger than he was willing to share. One of the bikers groaned from the floor, clutching his ribs. His voice was weak, but the words slipped out. You're military, aren't you?" The stranger didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said more than words ever could. His discipline, his control, the way he moved, it all spoke for him. The waitress took a small step forward, her eyes wide. "I've never seen anything like that," she whispered. You barely moved." The cook leaned against the window from the kitchen, his spatula still dangling in his hand. "Man fought like he's done it 1,000 times before," he muttered. Travis sat slumped at the table, his pride shattered more than his body. He glared at the stranger, his voice low, broken. "You ain't normal. People don't fight like that." The stranger leaned back in his booth, his shoulders relaxed again. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply looked at Travis with calm eyes and said, "Normal's overrated." The diner fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't fear that filled the air. It was respect, a hushed kind of awe. People weren't staring at him like an outsider anymore. They were staring like they'd just witnessed something they'd never forget. The waitress cleared her throat, trying to ground herself after everything she had just seen. I'll get you a fresh burger," she stammered. The stranger shook his head. "No need, this one's just fine." That answer made her blink. How could someone sit there, eating calmly after everything that had just happened? But then she realized, and this wasn't a man who needed recognition. This wasn't someone who thrived on attention. He was just steady, unshaken. An older man in the far booth, his farmer's hands calloused and worn, spoke for the first time. "Son," he muttered, shaking his head slowly. "I ain't never seen anything like that in my life." The stranger didn't respond. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and placed them neatly under the edge of his plate. He slid out of the booth, the sound of his boots against the floor echoing louder than any words could. As he reached the door, the waitress called after him, her voice almost desperate. "Wait, who are you really?" The man paused, his hand on the door. He turned slightly, meeting her eyes for just a second longer than expected. His voice came soft, almost like a whisper. "Just a guy who knows how to finish his lunch." Then he stepped outside. The bell above the door jingled faintly as it closed behind him. Inside the diner, no one spoke for a long time. The bikers groaned where they lay. The customers sat frozen, and the staff tried to process what they had just witnessed. But in every face, one thing was the same: awe, because they all knew they hadn't just watched a fight. They had seen something else: control, power without pride, strength without noise, and they knew deep down they'd never forget the stranger who walked in, ordered lunch, and left behind a lesson bigger than the fight itself. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as the stranger stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the late afternoon sun hanging low over Route 66, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked back toward his truck. Each step measured, unhurried, parked a few feet away. The youngest biker, the one who had bolted during the fight, stood frozen beside his motorcycle. His face was pale, his hands shoved into his pockets. For a moment he looked like he might speak, maybe even try to apologize. But when the stranger's calm eyes flicked toward him, the words died on his lips. He stepped aside quietly, giving the man space, like even standing too close might disturb something he couldn't explain. The stranger opened the truck door, climbed in, and turned the key. The old engine roared to life, steady and strong. He glanced once in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the diner behind him, the people still pressed against the windows, watching in silence. Then he shifted into gear and pulled out, his taillights shrinking as he disappeared down the empty road. Inside the diner, time began to move again. The waitress set the phone down on the counter, her hands still trembling. The cook muttered something under his breath and finally went back to his grill. Customers exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering about what they had just seen. But the bikers and the loudest voices in the room only minutes ago said nothing. Travis sat slumped at the table, his pride broken, his face etched with disbelief. He rubbed his wrist, still feeling the ghost of that iron grip. He tried to glare, but even he knew the look carried no weight anymore. For the first time in a long time, Travis didn't have anything to say. Word of the incident spread quickly. By the next morning, stories were being told at gas stations, barbershops, and dinner tables in nearby towns. "I was there," some would say proudly. "I saw it with my own eyes. That man, he barely moved. Took them all down like it was nothing." Others added details, each version of the story growing in awe with every retelling. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sweating, just calm, like he'd done it all before. The waitress told her version too. She'd shake her head, her eyes wide, and say, "I asked him who he was. You know what he told me? Just a guy getting lunch." The story became more than just a diner tale. It became a lesson whispered from one person to another. About control, about respect, about the quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. For the bikers, the lesson cut deeper. Bruises would fade, but humiliation lingered. Travis, once the loudest in every room, walked with a quieter step in the weeks that followed. When people teased him about the diner, his face flushed red and he muttered, "Forget about it." But he couldn't forget. None of them could. That day had stripped them of their arrogance and replaced it with something heavier: humility. As for the stranger, he didn't think twice about the incident. To him it was simple. He hadn't come to prove anything. He hadn't come to fight. He had come for a meal, and when trouble came knocking, he handled it the only way he knew how. With control, with discipline, without ego. Driving down that endless stretch of highway, he turned the radio dial until an old song hummed softly through the speakers. The road stretched out before him like a ribbon, the horizon glowing in fading sunlight. He thought about his past, about the missions no one would ever hear of, the people he had protected even when they didn't know they were in danger. That was enough for him. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. He sipped from a bottle of water he'd bought at the last gas station, leaned back into the seat, and let the miles roll by. To the people at the diner, he had been a mystery, a story to tell. To himself, he was just a man passing through, but the lesson he left behind would stay much longer than his footprints in the gravel. Respect isn't built on fear. Strength isn't about numbers, and power doesn't come from how loud you are. True strength is quiet. It's calm. It's in the ability to stand firm without rage, to act without cruelty, and to walk away without needing the world to notice. The people in that diner had seen something they would never forget. Not a fight, not violence, but a glimpse of what discipline, patience, and control really look like, and maybe, just maybe, it would remind them, and anyone who heard the story, that sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should never underestimate, because silence, when carried by the right kind of man, speaks louder than noise ever could.